My name is Emily Carter, and I was 24 years old when I learned how invisible a person can be, even to the people who raised her. I stood at the back of a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor, holding a slim folder against my chest, watching my parents take their seats in the front row. They were dressed the way they always dressed for important moments. My father's jacket was perfectly pressed. My mother's hair hadn't moved an inch. Between them sat my older sister, Lauren, calm and confident, already smiling as if she knew exactly how the day would end. They hadn't come for me. They didn't even know I would be there. They were here because they believed this meeting was about Lauren, about her future, about everything they had always said she represented. Pride, potential, a sure thing. I was just staff, a name on an internal list, a figure meant to blend into the walls. I stayed where I was, near the exit, exactly where people like me were expected to stand. No one looked my way. Not my parents, not my sister, not a single executive at the table. And as I watched them lean forward in anticipation, I knew something they didn't. Before this meeting was over, one name would be spoken out loud. And when it was, the story they had been telling themselves for years would finally fall apart. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. A long table stretched through the center, surrounded by senior leadership, their laptops already open, their voices low and controlled. This was the kind of room where decisions were made quietly and consequences rippled far beyond these walls. I had been in it many times before, always in the same position. Useful, silent, replaceable. My parents looked around with the confidence of people who believed they belonged. My mother whispered something to my father, and he nodded, his expression proud, almost relieved. Lauren sat straight-backed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked comfortable here. She always did in rooms like this, rooms where people expected great things from her. No one acknowledged me, not even a glance. I might as well have been part of the decor. I wasn't offended anymore. That kind of hurt dulls after a while. You stop reacting to it the way you stop reacting to background noise. Still, standing there, watching my parents prepare to celebrate the daughter they believed had a future, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, just recognition. This was how it had always been. The meeting hadn't officially started yet. Executives murmured to one another. A few assistants moved quietly along the walls, checking seating charts and schedules. I recognized the signs of a major announcement. This wasn't a routine update. This was something carefully staged, something meant to be seen and remembered. Families had been invited for a reason. I watched my father scan the room, his eyes searching for familiar faces, as if measuring the importance of the moment by who else had been allowed inside. My mother adjusted the sleeve of Lauren's blazer, smoothing it down with a smile that said, "This is your moment." Lauren didn't resist. She never had to. I shifted my weight, the folder in my hand suddenly heavier than it should have been. Inside were copies of reports I had worked on for months, data I had checked and rechecked, decisions I had quietly influenced without ever attaching my name to them, the kind of work that mattered only when something went wrong. I didn't come here today to be seen. I didn't expect recognition. I had learned a long time ago not to expect anything from rooms like this, or from the people sitting in the front row. I was here because it was my job to be here, because this was where the story had led, whether anyone realized it yet or not. As I stood there, I thought about how often I had watched my parents look past me, how easily their attention had always settled on Lauren. Pride and shame were words they never said out loud in public, but they didn't need to. Those labels lived in their choices, in who they invested in who they spoke about with excitement and who they spoke about with polite concern. The door at the far end of the room remained closed. The chairman hadn't arrived yet. The quiet grew heavier, more deliberate. Conversations faded. People straightened in their seats. I looked at my parents one last time before everything began. They were smiling, completely certain of how this story would unfold, certain of who mattered, certain of who didn't. I stayed where I was, unseen and unacknowledged. and waited. Because once that door opened, no one in that room would be able to pretend I didn't exist anymore. The first time they told me who mattered happened 4 years earlier, at our dining table, on a night that didn't look important at all. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that blended into every other weeknight of my childhood. The kitchen lights were too bright. The air smelled like roasted chicken and lemon cleaner, and the sound of silverware against plates filled the small pauses in conversation. My parents sat across from us, relaxed, comfortable, as if nothing about that night would change anything. Lauren was talking about her plans again. She always was. A new opportunity, a new connection, a new idea about where she might end up. My parents listened closely, nodding, smiling, occasionally interrupting with suggestions. They leaned toward her without realizing it, their bodies angled in her direction like sunflowers turning toward the light. I sat quietly, pushing food around my plate, listening more than speaking. That had become my habit by then. When you notice early enough that your words don't land the same way, you learn to save them. At some point, my father cleared his throat and set his fork down. The sound was deliberate, the way it always was when he was about to say something he considered important. "We need to start thinking realistically about the future," he said, his tone calm, almost thoughtful, about where to focus our energy. My mother nodded beside him. She folded her hands together and looked from Lauren to me, then back to Lauren, as if the answer were already obvious. My father turned fully toward my sister. "Lauren has momentum," he continued. "She knows how to carry herself. People respond to her. She has potential." Lauren smiled, a small, knowing smile. She didn't look surprised. She had grown up hearing variations of this her entire life. Then my father looked at me. The pause before he spoke my name felt longer than it probably was. Long enough for me to understand, even before the words came out, that this conversation wasn't going to end the same way for me. "Emily," he said, carefully, "you're capable. You're responsible. But not everyone is meant for the same kind of future." My stomach tightened. "We have to be practical," he went on. "You invest where there's return. Lauren has a trajectory. You'll find your own way." It wasn't said with anger. That almost made it worse. There was no cruelty in his voice, no raised volume, no dramatic rejection. Just certainty, as if he were explaining gravity. My mother didn't interrupt. She didn't disagree. She didn't even look uncomfortable. She kept her eyes on her plate, nodding slightly, as though this were a reasonable conclusion they had both reached long ago. Lauren glanced at me, briefly. Not with malice, not with pity, just curiosity, as if checking whether I understood what was being said. I did. I understood that this wasn't about grades or effort or choices. This was about value, about who was worth believing in, about who represented pride, and who represented risk. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I didn't point out all the times I had done exactly what was asked of me. Something inside me had gone very still, very clear. You don't fight a verdict that has already been decided. My father continued talking, now fully focused on Lauren again. He spoke about opportunities, about introductions he could make, about doors that might open for her if they planned carefully. My mother added details, her voice soft but enthusiastic. Together, they painted a picture of a future already in motion. There was no equivalent picture for me. No questions about my plans. No offers of support. No curiosity. The absence of those things was louder than anything that had been said out loud. Dinner ended the way it always did. Plates were cleared. The dishwasher hummed in the background. Lauren left the table smiling, already texting someone. My parents moved into the living room, continuing their conversation as if nothing remarkable had occurred. I went upstairs to my room and closed the door quietly behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the wall, replaying my father's words in my head. "You'll find your own way." It sounded generous on the surface. It wasn't. It was permission to stop caring. That night, Pieces of my childhood rearranged themselves in my memory. Moments I had brushed off suddenly made sense. The way praise always seemed to land just slightly out of my reach. The way my achievements were acknowledged politely, while Lauren's were celebrated. The way expectations had always been clearer for her than they ever were for me. This wasn't new. It was just finely spoken. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic or broken. What I felt was a quiet separation, like stepping out of a warm room into cold air. Painful, yes, but bracing, clarifying, lying in the dark. I made a decision I didn't say out loud to anyone. Not to my parents. Not to Lauren. Not even to myself. At least not in words. If I wasn't going to be their pride, I would stop living as if their approval was something I could earn. If they had already decided my limits, I would have to decide my own. The next morning, nothing had changed on the surface. My parents spoke to me the same way they always had. Lauren laughed over breakfast, already planning her day. I answered questions, nodded, moved through the house like a guest. But something fundamental had shifted. That was the night I stopped waiting to be chosen. I didn't leave my family in one dramatic moment. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no declaration that I was done. The distance happened quietly, the way erosion does, a little at a time, until one day you look back and realize the ground you were standing on is gone. After that dinner, nothing outwardly changed. My parents still called. Lauren still talked. The difference was what those conversations were about. Lauren's plans. Lauren's progress. Lauren's future. When my name came up, it was usually at the end, like an afterthought tacked onto a list that was already complete. "How's Emily doing?" my mother would ask, halfway through a conversation about Lauren's latest opportunity. "She's fine," my father would answer for me, without waiting. And that was that. I stopped correcting them. I stopped offering details. I learned that the less I said, the less it hurt. By the time I moved out, the separation already felt natural. I found a small apartment on my own. Nothing special. One bedroom. Thin walls. A window that faced another building instead of the street. It was the first place that was entirely mine. Paid for with money I earned myself. No safety net. No backup plan. Living without one forces you to become very organized. Very quickly. I learned to budget down to the dollar. I learned which expenses could be delayed and which couldn't. I learned that exhaustion feels different when there's no one to fall back on. Lauren's life looked very different. From the outside, it was impressive. Well supported. Carefully curated. My parents spoke about her with the same pride they always had, as if her success confirmed something fundamental about the way they had raised us. I listened. I nodded. I said all the right things. Inside, I was letting go. Family gatherings became easier once I stopped hoping for something different. I showed up. I smiled. I answered questions briefly. When conversations drifted back to Lauren, as they always did, I let them. There was a strange relief in no longer waiting to be seen. The real shift happened when I started working. I entered the company at a level so low no one expected anything from me. No introductions. No congratulations. Just a desk, a login, and a list of tasks that needed to be done. I noticed immediately how much of the workplace ran on confidence instead of competence, on who spoke first instead of who was right. I didn't speak first. I watched. I listened. I learned where decisions were actually made, and where they were only announced. I paid attention to the work no one wanted, the tasks that were pushed aside because they were tedious or unglamorous. Those became mine. I stayed late without making a show of it. I asked questions carefully. Privately, I double-checked numbers others accepted at face value. When something didn't make sense, I wrote it down instead of arguing about it. People began to rely on my work without really noticing me. Reports were accurate. Deadlines were met. Problems were handled quietly before they became problems at all. My name rarely came up in meetings. But my work did. I learned quickly that those were not the same thing. At first, it bothered me. Old habits die hard. A part of me still wanted someone to look up and say, "That was Emily." I recognized that part of myself immediately. And I ignored it. I had spent too many years waiting for recognition that never came. My parents asked about my job occasionally. Their questions were polite. Surface level, "What company? What role? Are you learning anything useful?" I answered honestly but briefly. There was no follow-up, no curiosity. The conversation always drifted back to Lauren. Lauren never asked. Not once. I don't think it was cruelty. I think it was comfort. When you're used to being the center, you don't think to check the edges. Over time, something unexpected happened. The absence of attention stopped feeling like a loss. Without it, I was free to define success in smaller, quieter ways. Getting through a hard week. Solving a problem no one else had noticed. Paying my rent on time. Sleeping without the familiar knot of anticipation in my chest. I stopped comparing myself to Lauren, not because I had proven anything, but because the comparison no longer served a purpose. We were living in different worlds, measured by different standards. The work itself began to change. There were murmurs of a larger project coming down the pipeline. I noticed the tension before it was acknowledged. Meetings that ran longer than scheduled. Conversations that stopped when certain people walked into the room. A sense of urgency that didn't quite have a name yet. I kept my head down and paid attention. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a set of documents that had passed through 3 other hands without comment, I felt a familiar clarity settle in. The same feeling I had had that night at the dinner table years earlier. The sense that something important was unfolding, whether anyone else was ready for it or not. I didn't know what the project would become. I didn't know how involved I would be. I only knew that whatever was coming, it wouldn't be solved by confidence alone. And for the first time in my life, I felt prepared. Not because anyone believed in me, not because I had been chosen, but because I had learned how to build something quietly, without permission, and without waiting for someone else to decide I was worth it. The tension didn't announce itself all at once. It crept in the way it always does in places where people are paid to stay calm. Meetings ran longer. Emails became more careful, more layered with language that sounded neutral but wasn't. Doors closed more often than they used to. And when they did open, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Something was wrong. I noticed it before anyone said it out loud, mostly because no one was looking in my direction. When you're invisible, you see everything. The project finally surfaced during a late afternoon meeting that had been added to everyone's calendar without explanation. No agenda, no context, just a time, a room, and the quiet implication that attendance wasn't optional. I took my usual seat near the wall, notebook open, pen ready, listening. The senior vice president spoke first. His tone was controlled, but tight. He explained that the company was facing pressure from multiple fronts. A major initiative, one that had been positioned as stable and low risk, was no longer either. Timelines were slipping, assumptions were unraveling. What had looked safe on paper was turning volatile in practice. As he spoke, I watched the faces around the table. Some were guarded. Some were carefully blank. A few were already calculating distance. No one volunteered to take ownership. That was the first thing that stood out to me. In a company where people usually competed for visibility, this silence was telling. The project carried too much risk, too much exposure, too many ways to be blamed if it failed. When my name was mentioned, it was almost an afterthought. I'd like Emily to support on the analysis side, someone said, glancing in my direction briefly. Documentation. Verification. Make sure everything lines up. No one looked at me when the decision was made. No one asked if I had capacity. It wasn't a request. It was an assignment. I nodded once and wrote it down. Support roles are strange that way. You're close enough to see the problem clearly, but far enough away that no one expects you to speak. Oversight is minimal. Expectations are low. It's easy to disappear in the work. I didn't. The deeper I went into the project, the more uneasy I became. Numbers that were supposed to reconcile didn't. Projections relied on assumptions that hadn't been tested. Entire sections of the plan were built on optimism instead of evidence. I could see how it had happened. Everyone involved had trusted the surface-level confidence of the presentation. No one had stayed long enough to question the foundation. I stayed. I worked late most nights. Long after the floor had emptied out, I cross-checked reports against raw data. I traced decisions back to their sources. When something didn't make sense, I didn't ignore it. I flagged it quietly, carefully, in notes that no one had asked for but would exist whether they wanted them or not. Others were focused on image, on how the project looked to leadership, on how their involvement would be perceived if things went well, and how quickly they could distance themselves if things didn't. I focused on whether the project could survive at all. The first real warning sign came a week later. I noticed a discrepancy in one of the core models. Small at first glance, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking closely. But when I followed it through, the implications were serious. The timeline everyone was relying on was built on a faulty assumption. If it wasn't corrected, the project would miss a critical milestone. Publicly, I brought it up in a small meeting, choosing my words carefully. "I think we may want to revisit this section," I said, sliding my notes across the table. "There's a dependency here that hasn't been accounted for." The response was polite, non-committal. Someone nodded. Someone else said they'd look into it. The meeting moved on. Nothing changed. I didn't push. Not yet. I had learned that timing mattered more than volume. Instead, I kept working. I documented everything. Dates, versions, conversations. I made sure the trail existed, even if no one wanted to follow it yet. As the days passed, the pressure increased. Leadership grew more anxious. Questions were asked more frequently, but always in the same direction. How do we present this? How do we manage expectations? How do we reassure stakeholders? No one asked whether the underlying problem had been fixed. Watching it unfold, I felt a familiar sense of recognition settle in my chest. The pattern was the same one I had grown up with. Confidence rewarded, quiet accuracy ignored. Decisions made based on who looked most certain, not who was most careful. The difference this time was that I wasn't a child at a dinner table. I wasn't dependent on anyone's approval to survive. I was already standing on my own. That didn't make the situation less dangerous. It made it clearer. One evening, as I was organizing my files, I realized something that tightened my grip on the mouse. If the project failed, someone would be blamed. The narrative would be shaped quickly, publicly, and without room for nuance. And I knew, with an uncomfortable certainty, that the people whose confidence had carried the project this far would not be the ones exposed. They never were. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling long after the office had gone quiet. I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. There was still time to correct the course, but not much. And if things continued the way they were, the truth would surface whether anyone wanted it to or not. The only question was whose name it would be attached to when it did. The project didn't collapse all at once. It fractured in small, undeniable ways that no amount of confident language could fully hide. Deadlines slipped quietly at first, then openly. Meetings multiplied, no longer spaced neatly across the week but stacked back to back, urgent and tense. The tone shifted from optimism to control. Questions were no longer about growth or opportunity, but about containment. How do we manage this? How do we explain that? How do we keep this from escalating? I listened, took notes, and watched my earlier concerns resurface as if they had appeared out of nowhere. In one meeting, a director frowned at a slide and said, "We've identified a dependency risk that needs to be addressed." It was my wording. Almost exactly. The same phrasing I had used weeks earlier. No one looked at me. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. The problem was being acknowledged. That was the point, wasn't it? But as the days passed, a pattern emerged that was harder to ignore. My analysis circulated without my name attached. My recommendations appeared in decks presented by others. My work was being used, absorbed, and rebranded as collective insight, team discovery, leadership alignment, strategic adjustment. Language has a way of smoothing over ownership. The moment it became impossible to deny happened during a mid-morning briefing with senior leadership. A colleague stood at the front of the room, confidently walking through a revised plan. I recognized every slide. I had built most of them myself. The structure, the logic, the caution built into each step. It was all there. What wasn't there was me. As the presentation ended, the room responded with relief. Nods. A few approving comments. Someone said, "This is exactly the kind of thinking we need right now." The praise landed squarely on the person holding the clicker. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, my expression neutral. Inside, something settled into place. This wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. I considered speaking up. The impulse rose quickly, sharp and familiar. Just say it. Correct the record. Claim what's yours. I could feel the words forming, ready to step into the room. Then I thought about the cost. I thought about how easily the narrative could turn. How quickly a woman who insists on being seen can be labeled difficult, defensive, not a team player. I thought about how often speaking up had changed nothing when I was younger, how the outcome had always been decided long before I opened my mouth. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I was paying attention. That same afternoon, my mother called. She sounded cheerful, energized in a way that immediately told me she had news. "We heard about the project," she said. "Your father ran into someone from the company. He said things are moving fast." I murmured something neutral, letting her continue. "They're very impressed with Lauren," she added. "They say she's right in the middle of everything. We're so proud of her." Of course they were. I listened as she talked, her voice warm and certain, as if the story had already been written. Lauren, once again, at the center. Lauren, the safe bet, the one whose future was worth celebrating out loud. When I hung up, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Tired of watching the same script play out in different settings, with different costumes, but the same roles. That night, I stayed late again. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I needed to see something clearly. I opened my files and went back through everything I had saved. Emails, drafts, timestamps, comments left quietly in shared documents. The trail was unmistakable. The work was mine. The warnings were mine. The solutions, too. I closed the folder slowly. For the first time since the project began, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I did nothing. If I let the narrative harden around someone else's name. If the project stabilized just enough to avoid disaster, and the credit remained misplaced. The thought didn't sit well, but neither did rushing. The pressure intensified over the next few days. Leadership grew visibly tense. Conversations became shorter, more guarded. The project had moved from private concern to public risk. There were rumors of a formal presentation coming up, a chance to reassure stakeholders, to present a unified front. Families, I heard, would be invited. The information landed with a strange weight. I could already picture my parents in that room, sitting straight-backed and proud, believing they were witnessing the confirmation of everything they had always believed. I could already hear the way my mother would talk about it afterward, the way my father would nod along, satisfied. I felt the old doubt stir, the familiar question that had followed me for years. Is staying quiet the same as disappearing? Had I erased myself again by choosing restraint? I pushed the thought away and focused on what I could control. If there was going to be a story told publicly, I wanted the truth ready to stand on its own, not as an accusation, not as a defense, just as a fact. By the end of the week, the meeting was officially scheduled. A formal review, high visibility, the kind of moment that shapes careers and rewrites perceptions. I looked at the calendar invite on my screen for a long time before closing it. If I stayed silent much longer, the story would be finalized without me. And once that happened, No amount of truth would matter. The announcement came through my inbox late on a Thursday afternoon. Buried between routine updates and calendar reminders, a formal review, full leadership attendance, families of key contributors invited. The language was careful, polished, confident. It framed the meeting as a moment of alignment, a chance to demonstrate stability and progress. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the meaning settle. This wasn't just about work anymore. Within hours, the reaction rippled outward. Conversations shifted. People speculated openly about seating, about who would present, about which names would be mentioned and in what order. Confidence returned to voices that had been cautious only days before. The story was being rehearsed. My parents received their invitation the next morning. My mother called immediately, barely containing her excitement. "Can you believe this?" she said, as if the answer weren't obvious. "They're inviting families. Your father says that only happens when someone's really made an impression." I pictured her holding the invitation, rereading it, already imagining where they would sit. I pictured my father nodding, satisfied, as if this confirmed something he had always known. Lauren's thrilled. My mother continued, "She's been so busy lately. But this feels like recognition." I listened, saying little. There was nothing to correct, nothing to add. The assumption was complete. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the screen without really seeing it. Part of me felt the old urge to explain, to step in and redirect the narrative before it solidified. The other part, the one that had grown stronger over the years, reminded me that explanation had never changed anything before. At work, my role was made clear quickly. I would be there early, helping coordinate materials and supporting the flow of the meeting. Logistics, background, necessary, but unseen. No one framed it as a slight. It was simply where I belonged in their version of events. I accepted without hesitation. In the days leading up to the meeting, I prepared quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't hint. I didn't warn anyone. I reviewed my documentation again, making sure everything was complete and accurate. Dates aligned. Versions tracked. Contributions unmistakable to anyone willing to look closely. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing for truth. The night before the meeting, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was nervous about being exposed, but because I was thinking about what I actually wanted from the moment that was coming. I had imagined recognition so many times over the years, always paired with a hope that it would fix something, that it would finally make me visible in the way I had needed as a child. Lying in the dark, I understood something I hadn't before. No moment, no matter how public, could give me back what had never been offered freely. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about ending a lie. The morning of the meeting, the building felt different, more polished, more deliberate. Signs were placed carefully. Security was heightened. Staff moved with quiet urgency, adjusting chairs, testing microphones, aligning name cards. I arrived early, as instructed. The room was larger than the boardroom upstairs, designed for visibility. Rows of chairs faced a low stage where leadership would sit. Screens flanked the space, already glowing with the company logo. Everything was arranged to look confident, controlled, reassuring. I checked materials, answered questions, made myself useful without drawing attention. From my position near the side, I could see everything without being seen. Families began to arrive just before the scheduled start time. I recognized my parents immediately. My father wore the same suit he always wore to important events. My mother looked carefully put together, her expression bright with expectation. Between them, Lauren walked easily, scanning the room as if she belonged there. They didn't see me. I watched them find their seats in the front section, close enough to the stage to feel involved. My mother leaned in to whisper something to Lauren, who smiled in response. My father sat back, hands folded, surveying the room with quiet satisfaction. The familiarity of it all settled over me like a well-worn coat. This was how it had always been. Them, centered and certain. Me, just outside the frame. The chairman hadn't arrived yet. People spoke in low voices, glancing toward the stage, straightening jackets, checking phones. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Whatever doubts had existed earlier were being replaced by performance-ready confidence. I stood where I was meant to stand, clipboard in hand, blending into the periphery. I felt calm in a way that surprised me. Not detached, not numb, just steady. As the minutes passed, I thought about how much of my life I had spent trying to move from the edge into the center. How much energy I had wasted hoping someone else would notice what I already knew to be true. Standing there now, I realized I didn't want that anymore. I didn't need to be chosen. I needed the truth to exist out loud. When the doors at the back of the room finally opened and the chairman walked in, the shift was immediate. Conversation stopped. People rose slightly in their seats. Attention snapped into focus. I watched my parents straighten, their faces bright with anticipation, still convinced this moment belonged to someone else. I stayed where I was, unseen, and waited. They still believed the story was theirs to tell. The room settled into a quiet that felt heavier than silence, the kind that comes right before something irreversible happens. Chairs stopped shifting. Phones disappeared into pockets. Every face turned toward the stage as the chairman took his seat, his presence altering the air without a word. From where I stood along the side wall, I could see my parents clearly. My father leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, his attention fixed on the stage. My mother sat straight-backed, her lips pressed into a proud, expectant smile. Lauren looked composed, confident, her gaze steady, as if this were simply the next step in a path she had always assumed was hers. No one looked at me. The chairman began speaking in a measured, authoritative tone. He talked about uncertainty, about pressure, about the way this past year had tested the company in ways no forecast could have predicted. He spoke about responsibility, about the difference between confidence and competence, about the cost of overlooking details when the stakes are high. As he spoke, I felt the room lean in, drawn by the gravity of his words. This wasn't a celebration yet. It was an accounting. He described the project's early promise, then its unraveling. He didn't soften the truth. He acknowledged missteps, assumptions that hadn't held, risks that had been underestimated. The air grew tighter with each sentence. I saw shoulders stiffen. I saw a few executives glance down, avoiding eye contact. Then his tone shifted. He spoke about what had stopped the project from collapsing entirely, about the work that had gone unnoticed at first, dismissed as support, buried under louder voices, about persistence, about precision, about someone who had stayed with the problem when others had stepped back. My mother leaned closer to my father, whispering something I couldn't hear. Lauren's posture sharpened, her confidence narrowing into focus. The chairman paused. It was a small pause, but it stretched, drawing every eye forward. I felt my heart beat slow instead of quicken. I had imagined this moment in a dozen different ways. None of them like this. No drama, no build-up. Just a space where truth could land. The person who identified the critical flaws, he continued, who documented the risks, who proposed the corrective path that allowed us to stabilize and move forward, did so without seeking attention or recognition. He looked out across the room. Emily Carter. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the silence fractured. Heads turned. Chairs shifted. A ripple moved through the room as people searched for the name they hadn't expected. I stepped forward from the wall, my movements calm, deliberate, as if this were just another task I had been assigned. Applause started unevenly, then grew, filling the space with a sound that felt both distant and overwhelming. I didn't look at my parents yet. I kept my eyes on the chairman as I approached the front, feeling the weight of every step without letting it change my pace. From the corner of my vision, I saw my mother's face drain of color. Her smile disappeared, replaced by something open and unguarded, something like shock. My father sat frozen, his hands still clasped, his expression unreadable. Lauren stared at me, her certainty collapsing into confusion she didn't know how to hide. I reached the front and stopped where the chairman indicated. He nodded once, a gesture of respect rather than ceremony. "Emily's work," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room, "was thorough, disciplined, and essential. She raised concerns early, documented them clearly, and stayed with the solution when it would have been easier to step away. That kind of integrity is what leadership looks like when no one is watching." The applause grew louder. I stood there, hands loosely at my sides, my expression steady. I didn't smile. I didn't look for anyone's reaction. This moment didn't belong to the version of me that had waited for approval. It belonged to the woman who had learned how to stand without it. When I finally looked toward the front row, my parents were staring at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Not as an idea, not as an afterthought, as a fact they could no longer edit. There was no satisfaction in their shock, no triumph, just a quiet certainty settling into place. The chairman concluded his remarks, and the meeting moved forward. But the energy in the room had shifted irreversibly. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. People glanced at me with new awareness, as if recalibrating something they had misunderstood. As I stepped away from the stage, executives approached with congratulations, with questions, with interest that felt genuine but overdue. I accepted it politely, professionally, without urgency. I didn't need to hold on to it. Across the room, my parents remained seated. My mother wiped at her eyes, not in a show of emotion but in something closer to grief. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his certainty stripped away. Lauren looked down at her hands, her confidence shaken, replaced by something quieter and more complicated. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one trying to explain. The meeting ended soon after. People stood, voices rising, the spell breaking into motion and noise. I stepped back into the periphery, letting the moment finish without me clinging to it. As I did, I understood something with absolute clarity. They were looking at me now, not because I had demanded it, not because I had asked for permission, but because the truth had spoken my name out loud. And once it had, there was no way for anyone in that room to pretend I didn't exist anymore. The room didn't explode after the applause. It exhaled. People stood, chairs scraping softly against the floor, voices overlapping in low, careful tones. The spell of the moment loosened. But it didn't disappear. It lingered in the way people looked at me now, with a consideration that hadn't been there before. Not curiosity. Recognition. I stepped aside instinctively, letting others move past me. A few executives stopped to shake my hand. They spoke about diligence and judgment, about how rare it was to see someone stay with a problem when it stopped being glamorous. I thanked them and moved on. I didn't feel the need to anchor myself to the praise. It wasn't going anywhere. My parents approached slowly, as if the air between us had thickened. My mother spoke first. My name sounded unfamiliar in her mouth. Careful and tentative. She said she hadn't known. She said she was proud. The words landed gently, without weight. Not because they were false, but because they were late. My father stood beside her, silent. When he finally spoke, he didn't explain. He didn't defend. He simply said, "I didn't see this coming." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was an admission of surprise. I nodded. That was all. Lauren hovered just behind them, her expression unsettled. She congratulated me quietly. There was no rivalry in her voice, no bitterness, just confusion and something that sounded like humility. I thanked her too. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. I didn't argue the past. I didn't correct the timeline. I didn't list the ways they had missed me. I had learned that clarity doesn't come from debate. It comes from boundaries. "I'm glad you're here," I said, because it was true. But this doesn't change everything. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. She nodded slowly, as if she understood that this moment wasn't an eraser. It was a line. After they left, The room felt lighter. Not empty. Resolved. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. There was no sudden parade of meetings or dramatic shifts. Work continued. Projects moved forward. But the way people spoke to me changed. My input was requested, not assumed. My name stayed attached to my work. I didn't become loud. I didn't need to. Visibility came to me without effort. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something I had to earn by shrinking. At home, my phone rang more often. Messages came from family members who had watched the meeting online, from acquaintances who suddenly remembered me. I responded selectively, not out of spite, out of care for my own quiet. A few weeks later, my parents visited. We met for coffee in a place near my apartment. The conversation was cautious but honest. They asked questions they had never asked before. I answered the ones I wanted to answer. When the conversation drifted toward old regrets, I steered it back to the present. That was the only place I was willing to meet them. With Lauren, things changed slowly. We began to talk without the old script running underneath. No comparisons. No competition. Just two women learning who the other had become. At work, responsibility expanded. Not in grand gestures, but in trust. I was given space to lead quietly, to make decisions that mattered without needing to announce them. It felt right. One evening, months later, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming outside my window, and thought about the girl I had been at that dinner table years ago, the one who had gone upstairs and closed her door, believing she had been measured and found lacking. I understood her now in a way I hadn't then. She hadn't been lacking anything. She had simply been standing in the wrong frame. I used to believe that being seen was the same as being valued, that if I could just stand in the center of the room, everything would finally make sense. What I learned instead is that worth doesn't arrive when someone calls your name. It arrives when you stop needing them to. The moment in that room didn't heal the past. It didn't need to. It gave me something better. It gave me permission to stop explaining myself. If you're listening to this and you've ever been the quiet one, the dependable one, the person whose work was always there but rarely named, I want you to know something. You are not invisible. You've just been underestimated. And sometimes karma doesn't arrive with a crash. Sometimes it simply tells the truth out loud, at a moment when no one can look away. If this story felt familiar, if it stirred something you recognize, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from, or what part of this stayed with you. And if you want to spend more time with stories like this, about quiet strength, late recognition, and learning to choose yourself, you're welcome to stay here. Subscribe if you'd like. I'll be here, telling the truth, one story at a time. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.